You're listening to the Product Coalition podcast with Jay Stansel. This is where product mastery happens. This is where careers are made. Welcome to the Product Coalition podcast. Let's go.
Welcome back to the Product Coalition podcast. I am Jay Stansel, your host, and today I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it hits a nerve that every product leader feels at some point. My guest today is Jürgen Dauk. Jürgen has spent nearly 30 years inside global enterprise technology companies. He's held senior leadership roles at Oracle, Avaya, OpenText, Planview, and Quadient, amongst many others. He's led international teams of over 160 people, managed full P&L responsibility across multiple regions, and worked shoulder to shoulder with executives navigating complex transformation initiatives. Now, Jürgen is also the author of the Leadership Operating System and currently advises a US-based software startup on scaling their go-to-market strategy. But here is what makes this conversation different today that Jürgen and I are going to have. Jürgen does not just talk about growth in theory. He's lived inside the machine. He's watched firsthand how companies lose speed the bigger they get because of how decisions get made. So what starts as alignment often becomes friction. Layers build within inside businesses. And suddenly the team that used to ship fast is now stuck in a cycle of meetings, approvals, and second guessing each other's decisions. So today we're going to dig into three specific threads. First, where the decision bottlenecks actually emerge in product organizations and why most leaders do not see them until it's too late. Secondly, why the alignment structure companies build to stay coordinated often backfires, and that creates the very friction they were designed to prevent. And third, what product leaders can practically do to redesign decision making so teams move faster without losing clarity. Jürgen, I'm so excited to get into this topic today. It means a lot to me, always has done throughout my career, and I'm sure for many others. Thank you for joining me today on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Jay. Good morning, and really excited to be on your show.
Jürgen, before we get into some of the specifics around losing speed, I'm keen to firstly know, why is this such a passion pain point for you? Why do you enjoy looking at this problem space of why companies lose speed?
Yeah, very good question. So when I started my career, I started in a startup-like company locally here in Germany. They were inventing and producing hardware and software for a very specific market. Initially to finance my studies at university, and later on I stayed at the company for almost 12 years. And so the company grew, right? And what we had when we started, we were around, I would say, just shy of 30 people when I first joined the company. Everything was very agile and naturally, right? So we would exchange viewpoints. You would have sales, marketing, software engineers all being together. And that made conversations quite easy. And everybody was on the same page automatically. And not only information flew naturally around, but also decision-making appeared to be natural because, things were discussed, everybody could come up with an idea, and then it was discussed amongst different, subject matter experts, and then we came to a conclusion, and that felt more natural. So when I saw that company growing, I saw, as you said, I saw it to become slower. So new management practices were put in place, and you could see the distance between the different functions in the organization was simply growing between sales, marketing, product management, development, and a classical hierarchical structure was implemented, and this is where I see it so often die. And then after leaving that company, I worked for some of the largest tech companies, such as Oracle and OpenText. And what I saw again was I worked mainly in middle management or upper management. And I saw the same thing. So what was supposed to be a matrix organization in reality was, as in many companies, a classical command and control siloed organization. So information wouldn't flow really. Instead of trusting the people and asking people what they think, information was limited and decision was ultimately made at the top. And there was no real working together. And it was the opposite, there were KPIs for specific functions. And, nobody was tracked against the overall progress or the overall good of the company. So you would find the development team just measured on, outputs in their area. Then you would have the sales team just being measured on, how many deals do you close? What's your forecast accuracy? But it didn't seem like one whole company or unit. And I personally felt a lot of pain in that because, there was high expectation and pressure on me to deliver whatever, in that case, outcome was expected. But I felt quite limited in my influence that I can take on that. And I felt like I also had to make decisions without knowing every in and out of an area, right? And this is why so first I became frustrated about it, being in the middle, being squeezed out and having the feeling like there's a lot of theater played around and a lot of alignment meetings without getting things done. And then I got passionate because I saw other models that seemed to be working better and seemed to be closer to what I saw in this first company when it was still a startup company. And this is what I got really passionate about in the last few years.
Nice. So there was this moment in your career where you had a moment and realized this is broken. This can't be what it should be forever, and I want to go on a mission and solve this problem for companies. As part of that realization, then, what was your personal first step to understanding better ways that companies could operate before you went out and started applying change?
Yeah. So first, I wanted to get familiar with the topic. I wrote books about it, but that's all just theory. And then I started to reach out to people that I heard from, that I found on LinkedIn, that were involved in those change processes, that were running different organizational models. I started to talk to them, interview them. I started to meet them in their companies, and I wanted to understand, how does it work? What system are you using? But I also wanted to know, we all know theory sounds great, but what are you struggling with? What are the biggest hurdles to overcome when moving to such systems? And I've found that fascinating. One thing that came up that surprised me a bit was I was talking to a transformation leader that led the transformation in I believe 4 or 5 Spanish companies, right? And I asked him, what was the biggest thing for you to make those transformations successful, to make sure they're not failing. And the surprising thing he was saying, we had to first change how people view people and the world.
So that sounds like a very cultural starting point.
Yeah, and it sounded a bit like philosophical to me, but I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he said, look, in traditional organizations, the view of the world and the perception of employees is they are lazy. If we don't control them, they can't be trusted, and they would never make the best decisions. So this is the worldview. And, to counter that, you need very clear rules. You need to control them. You need to tell the people exactly what they have to do, and view them more like a cog in a machine, right? And he said to me, once you change that to a model where you perceive your people as great, they're not just a human resource, they are all unique with their strengths and weaknesses, with their creativity, with their passion. They're great people. They can be passionate, and they can do great things. And once you change that, you can start building an organization that is centered around your talent that you have. And when we discussed that in further detail, I said, and regarding big decisions, and he said, wait a moment. He said, what were your biggest decisions in life? Not in job, in life, like in your private life. I said, well, I'm together with my wife for over 35 years. And, at one point we decided to marry, to have kids. We have 3 kids. We bought a house. He said, Jürgen, those are quite significant, big decisions in your life, right? I said, yes. And he said, do you know the situation where you had to get an approval to buy a new laptop for $1,000? I said, yes, that's quite the norm. He says, yeah, and that is the disconnect. If you don't trust your people, that they can make good decisions if they have all the information they need, right? How do you expect them, to run full throttle?
Okay. So when you've been looking at the landscape and obviously different industries, but you obviously across particularly Europe and the US in your exposure, can I ask you, to get us going, in aggregate, is it culture is the number one reason that teams tend to slow down as companies grow? Or is it overhiring? Or is it wrong CEO for the next phase of the business? Like, what is the most common reason if we had to sort of force rank something to the top here?
Yeah, for me, it's the old classical command and control system. We've built systems where nobody can flourish, really, where neither information flows at speed, where control and command is top down. And those systems were, invented and implemented at a time where markets were very stable, where, the speed of change was not like what it is today. You would build a car, and like if you look at Ford Motor Company, right? I mean, it was all about optimizing the flow, which was a great innovation at that time, right? And then Toyota came with a different system to pull stuff in instead of those rigorous planning. I think what we're seeing today is the speed of change is something we never had before, and it will only increase with AI, right? And then you see world crisis, you see new tax regulations, markets changing quickly. And the systems that we have built are not made for quickly changing markets. They're made for stable markets. And they are not centered around human brilliance, right? They were just made for stable markets where you need workers that do what some geniuses at the top would tell them to do.
Nice. Yeah, the old world was incremental improvements, and from a product management perspective, my backlog is typically incremental, evolutionary, and then revolutionary. And so it helps me think about the risk of the bets. Now, back in the day, change was expensive and experimentation was expensive. When we think back to those factory concepts, but obviously with software, it's got incredibly cheaper, and now with agentic tooling combined with software, it's got even cheaper still. When it comes to the mindset shift that change is not expensive if you get it wrong, and there could be a good upside by getting it wrong because you'll learn something, and experimentation to work out what the right change is no longer expensive, particularly in the software world. What does it look like to leaders that you're working with on how you seed this change of mindset so that they are now open to alternatives, and what are those alternatives?
So the alternatives that I'm seeing is that you're moving away from this classical structure and have cross-functional, more agile teams, right? And that you remove the hierarchy. And if you work cross-functionally, just imagine you have developers, product managers, but also sales and marketing, talking directly to each other. And really asking, I mean, we have all the data about customer behavior and ideal customer profile, but it makes a whole different world if you're talking to the customer actually. And, just imagine, in product management, your whole reality is based on data. And, I've spoken to my last chief product officer I worked with, and she was brilliant, but she didn't have the time and resource for anybody to really visit enough customers. So there was a lot of money spent on a data lake project, on gathering information, but it was never verified. And the people who actually talked to the customer were in sales, in customer success, but there was no real linkage between those departments actually talking to customers and marketing, who were trying to address ideal customer profiles, and product management and development. So I've seen a number of cases where, based on data, what was designed as new features and new improvements seemed to be right, but customer acceptance wasn't that great.
Okay. I want to bring the conversation back to the word you used earlier, which was theatre. I think that's a really important point to touch on, because continue with that scenario of a CPO getting out and talking to more customers. That's possible, feasible, generally realistic for them to make some changes in their world so that they can do that. However, when they bring the insights back that are ideally more substantial or better synthesized, there's better definition of what the customer needs versus what they want, and they've got a better story to tell, there is still, in a large organization or even a non-startup, let's just say, generally speaking, this theater of performance that you mentioned earlier. So whilst product people can go out and do their job better, what is it that they need to do to enable the rest of the organization to change the way they work with product? What are the difference of conversations they need to be having? What is the change that they need to be spreading, either externally and being a champion of, or internally champion it to demonstrate that it works? Because the theatre is going to exist anyway, no matter how good you are at your job. So how do you see through that theatre? Should you be calling it out? And how do you have different conversations to try and get rid of some of the theater and bring it back to some of the action?
Yeah, so it all depends on which level you are, right? The higher you are in a classical organization, the easier it is to make a change and convince people that separate KPIs or conflicting KPIs won't fix the issues. And if cost and revenue are not aligned with your plan, that putting more pressure isn't solving it. I think if you're not in the top ranks of the org structure, what worked best for me is to seek some informal alignments, right? And instead of spending your time on those official reporting calls that block a lot of your week, just talk to peers in other functions and say, look, why don't we get together? Ultimately, we might have conflicting KPIs, but we have the same goal, right? We want to make sure we're successful as a company. Why don't we get together? Ideally, you're proposing to have an offsite meeting to really sit together and try to understand each other. If that's not in the budget, I would at least have a regular, and it can be once a quarter, a call where you're coming together and just brainstorming, talk about your issues, talk about what you're seeing and what you believe. And sometimes it's a real aha moment.
Okay. I'm going to try and discover a little bit from you here, Jürgen, around cultural differences, around making some of this progress. I spoke about in the introduction that alignment often turns into friction instead of clarity. There's a process is agreed, there's approach is agreed, and then execution happens, and it turns out it's created bureaucracy, not acceleration. I don't want to talk about that generally, though. What I'm really interested in, Jürgen, is you've worked across Europe and America as Avaya. Where do you see differences and similarities around cultural approaches to both establishing process, but also where those cultures do turn into friction instead of clarity? Because I hypothesize that the way we go about work in Germany is going to be different to the way we go about work as a startup in San Francisco, for instance. Is that an actual reflection of what you've seen and experienced? And again, how does alignment turn into friction in both cultures?
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. So I think cultures are really, really different. And I think the biggest point is really, if you're trying to understand, right, then it's a very good basis for avoiding misunderstandings and cultural differences. And I give you an example or a few examples. So one of the early ones was in this first startup that I worked for, right? We had a major OEM customer from Japan, and our logistics department was communicating with them via email about how things get shipped to Japan. And so our responsible person for that logistic part sent an email and said, look, this is how we're going to do it, and la-di-la-di-la. And he got back an email saying something like, no, it can't be done like that. It has to be this way. So he said, understand your requirements, but due to local regulations, doesn't work, but it might be this. And he got just the same email back again. Cultural difference. So he got, in the end, the same email 7 times. And at that point, they were just booking a flight coming over to Germany to discuss. And what the problem was, the receiving party at the other side could culturally not say no.
Right.
It wasn't just an acceptable behavior. So it was really the understanding part. Same as for, like in Germany, people would be very direct. They would say, look, this is simply not good enough. There are markets where you would package it more like, look, in general, great work. There is this element which was not quite good. And I've seen that in discussions where somebody sitting in Europe was saying, well, that went quite well. So everything was, every feedback was positive, and there was just this minor thing. And I said, well, I think the message they wanted to bring across is it was crap. And it was just made very polite. So really understanding what the other person wants to say and wants to achieve is, I think, the biggest cultural difference.
Right. Okay. Within that, some of those stakes can be very high stakes. You mentioned an example there, like internationally, intercontinental example. When it comes to the speed of decision making and the stakes are high, what is it that needs to change? What is it that needs to be different versus the day-to-day stakes around decision making?
So first question is, is it reversible?
Okay.
Right? So it's a difference if I could just make a decision, and if it turns out to be a bad decision, you can revert without a high impact, right? If it's a decision with high impact, or with which can't be easily reverted, or a lot of money would have been spent, or you just can't turn it back, then I think traditionally it's okay, you need more approvals. But I think the real essence is how much information do we need to make a really informed decision, right? And what consequences do we have to take? And I think, people who are closest to the action can actually make a much better decision than somebody who has got a huge seniority but doesn't understand the real question really well. So for me, it's not so much about the seniority, really, and you can consult people, but the decision ideally has to be made by somebody who really understands the topic. So just imagine your company is designing, I don't know, power plants, right? So investments are huge. And if you have to make an important design decision, I think the person best suited for such a decision is somebody who knows the details of the product.
Okay.
Right? If that person understands the financial impact and has got all information, then I think it makes more sense for that person to make the decision than somebody who's, really far away from the actual thing that needs to be decided on.
Okay. So to make that work in reality, is there for the social agreement up front before any decisions made around and understand who makes what decision and documenting that? Or is that therefore going to just create a bottleneck in itself where lots of decisions always come to one person, because most decisions are, I don't know, maybe financial investment decisions rather than operating principle or method decisions.
So it's you need clear rules and guidelines. It's not just I empower you to make a decision and half of it is missing. You don't know up to what level, whom you need to consult before you make a decision. So you need really, really clear guidelines. You need to document that. You need to train the people. One of the biggest transformation initiatives I'm seeing right now is with a big pharma company, and I've been with them 2 weeks ago, and it's really a massive undertaking to have such it's a real giant company, right? And they wanted to move quickly into distributed decision making. So, and when that was first announced, people were really scared because they were not used to making decisions on their own. But more importantly, they didn't understand what the guidelines were, right? So what are the guardrails? How do I make decisions? Whom can I consult, or should I or have to consult before I make that ultimate decision? Also, how do we deal with conflict? Right? You can put people together in a dynamic team, but how do we handle conflict?
Can I ask, what are some of the world-class ways you've seen the answers to those questions you just mentioned distributed, socialized, and taught or onboarded? How does that work? How do you get these manifestos out into multi-thousand person companies in a way that it's just not another email or a PDF or a slide deck, but it's actually socialized, engaged with, and adopted? What does that look like in great practice?
So the bigger the company is, I would, from what I've seen, say the better it is to start in one area and to have a strong supporting team that works with that area. And what does it mean is the team where you're starting needs to be part of setting up those guardrails, right? They need to be on board. They need to be part of developing a manifesto on how we deal with conflict, right? They need to be part of how transparent are we with financials, with salaries. And I would start with a team. You need, strong supporters in that team that really say, okay, a lot of uncertainty, but we're up for that. It's not only that it's needed, but we are actually interested and want to drive that change. And I've talked to at a transformation conference last year to an extended board member of a large automotive manufacturer, right? And he said, there's no doubt we need to do this change because we're becoming too slow and we're losing out on foreign competition. And they were like discussing, how do we approach that? And they started in one area. And surprisingly, it was their traditional finance silo. And, his feedback was there were a lot of people who were really up for it, were enthusiastic, wanted to contribute. Of course, some, wanted to, leave as quickly as possible, and they changed to other departments, right, that were not moving. But he said, he was surprised how many people were really up for that, although they were scared of the unknown.
Okay, so this comes back to like sort of psychological safety that can often represent culture. But in a large organization, you mentioned in that example a department that was making change and one that isn't in the same entity. most people listening in are not sat at the top seat here, and as much as you say, talking about distributed decision making and cross-functional working, etc., there is, as you also said, still a traditional org chart a lot of the time there. What is the realistic change that can happen at the grassroots level, at a team-based level, to improve the decision speed, but without creating disruption throughout the rest of the organization? What can the middle management and the individual employees genuinely take away today to think about, here's what I'm going to do starting on Monday different, to improve decision-making speed in this entity, even though it's not coming down yet from the top down, and I don't want to wait forever for that to happen?
Yeah, I would align with cross-functionally. Typically, you are in those organizations, you are siloed. Reach out to them, make the proposal, and say, look, I'm fascinated about different ways of working. You're probably as frustrated as I am with, working in different directions. Why don't we stick our heads together on how to make it different and try things out, right? And trying things out and brainstorming and taking small steps isn't that risky. And you can then prove, look, this is working better than what we had before. But, build the trust, small steps, and work together, informal. It doesn't have the big shot in the beginning. But if you want to convince higher management, it's really start at your level with your peers, get them on the table, and just brainstorm. How could we do better together instead of having those big alignment calls and everything? How could that be done easier?
Can I ask, Jürgen, what are some ways that those same individuals can quantitatively demonstrate an experiment of change has been successful or has not been successful and it's had no effect or a negative effect? What are some of the ways that your business leaders you're working with are looking for to measure change is effective around decision speed?
Yeah, I mean, there are two elements, right? One is if you just look at what is measured today, which is, on the sales side, it's revenue, customer success, it's churn. In development, you have flow time, flow velocity, right? But that is not a combined outcome. I think, if you're starting to do that and just measuring, did my flow velocity in development increase? No, it's not about that. But you could measure customer feedback and, customer happiness, net promoter score on new stuff that you are bringing out, new features, new functionality, and see, is there a difference by working together? And same, like if you look at marketing, there probably, if you talk about conversion rates, does it make a difference if I understand my customer better and get more and quicker feedback if I talk to sales? Those are elements where you can measure outcomes. But I would also track another thing. I would ask employees, how do you feel? Do you feel more empowered? Do you feel more part of the whole thing? Are you more motivated? Does it change anything? So if you give people more decision power and have them being more involved, does it change their attitude?
Nice.
And from my experience, this is where you see the quickest change.
Okay, and so in those large organizations, they typically got culture surveys that HR teams are operating and running, employee net promoter score, and those types of things as well. I can imagine if I'm in middle management in a large organization, asking people how they feel about the organization, how it's making decision making, could be perceived as the start of almost a mutiny. Someone down on the ship floor is trying to work out how happy the crew are and wanting to make change. So how do people go about that socially in a way that doesn't come across that you're trying to create a revolution from the bottom down? What is the language look like so that when an executive hears that this surveying of employees is going on, they're not of fear of it, they're actually endorsing it?
Yeah, I wouldn't run a massive survey amongst people. I would talk to the people that are in my department, that are in further departments. I would simply ask them, right? Do you feel a difference? Does it help? What are we missing? Those things. I think if you're asking those questions, you don't need a big survey, right? If you as a manager just ask your team, what do you think about this? How do you feel? Does it help you? Or where are you struggling? What are you missing? What am I missing? What are we missing?
Nice. An observation I've got right now, Jürgen, is that when I think about my time in software over the last 30 years, is when it comes to making process, procedure, or in this instance, really, it's a cultural change as well in an organization. Other than the transformation hype of Agile 15 years ago, this is without doubt the best window to start thinking about how we could do things different, and the best window to stand out as either a potential future leader of a company or an existing leader of a company, because there is so much tooling change that happens. And as the tools change, the cultures and the processes tend to change around them as well. And I would actually encourage people to be brave in this moment, because another window like this of revolution with the tools that you're changing, the tool set's going to change more in the next 3 years than it's done in the last 25, probably, when it comes to Microsoft Word and Excel and databases and access to code and those types of things. What is it that you would like the audience to walk away with when it comes to being brave and thinking about how they could implement change to make decisions faster?
Yeah, I think so 2 elements. One is ask yourself, what's my view of the world and the people around me? I think that helps when before going into what's the ideal future state of my role, my career, and the ways of working. I think those are essential questions. And then if you're thinking about new tools, so mainly how AI is revolutionizing all industries, right? You can look at it from, what will AI take away and at what speed? But the other side, and I think more and more people are getting that, is, well, what amazing things could we do with this new technology? So if you have great people and better tooling, right, you should be able to make amazing stuff. So, but I think, looking at those 2 angles, what could we build and how do we look at the world and the people are essential questions.
Nice. I like that point on bringing it back. Jürgen, for those that are at the start of their career and that are going into their first role, their first organization, whether it's startup or enterprise, what is it around that clean slate opportunity of starting your career you would like them to really be thinking about for day 1, month 1, and year 1 of their career?
So it's something that is really dear to my heart, because I've got 3 boys, right? And the 2 older ones are on the verge of going into their first roles. And we were discussing a lot, and they wanted to know, they said, well, Dad, you've been in business for so long. What would be your advice if I want to become successful in my career? And I said, look, my advice would be, things will change much quicker than at the time when I stepped into the world of business and career. So my advice would be, try to find areas that you really love doing, right? That you're passionate about, because naturally you will become good in those areas. And, change needs to be built in. There is no, I take this university degree and then I go into the job and this is my career for the rest of the life. Things will change. And, just don't try to fight it, but see the opportunity in it. I think, getting into areas you're passionate about, try to find what excites you, and then, embrace the change. And there's massive potential in change. There's always been.
Yeah, and I think with that change brings new opportunities and working in environments that you could never dream of 25 years ago. The fact that we can remote work, that you can sit in a jungle and work if you prefer to be outside, or I think finding those working environments where the change will happen within the environment, but the environment itself may be a constant, is also going to help those young people find those places that they just love working in as their career changes over time.
Yeah.
Jürgen, this has been an absolute pleasure of a topic. I really appreciate the wisdom and the experience you brought into today's session. I also really appreciate those points you brought across around cultural differences, around US, European ways of thinking, and why it's so important to not only focus on the speed of decision making, but focus on how the way we talk to each other and we interact with each other will affect the speed of that decision making as well, because we all are products of different environments and therefore think about making decisions in different ways. So again, I really appreciate those perspectives.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jay, for having me on the show. It was a real pleasure, and I was looking forward to that, really.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to the audience as well for listening in and joining myself and Jürgen today on this session around why product teams slow down as they grow. If you'd like to learn more about Product Coalition, you can do so over at productcoalition.com. Until the next episode, thank you very much.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of the Product Coalition podcast, hosted by Jay Stansel. Got questions or want to explore more topics? Connect with Jay on LinkedIn or join the ever-growing Product Coalition community on Substack. Thanks for listening.